Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar on the rights of rivers. This is the first in a series of webinars that we will host as part of our Rights of Nature campaign. Today's conversation is part of the growing global movement on the rights of nature. In his inaugural lecture at the Senate Room of the University of the Witwatersrand yesterday, Professor Vishwas Sadka argued that we must approach the crisis of our time as a planetary problematic. Just to take a step back on our Rights of Nature campaign, I'd like to remind us that on the 29th of August 2020, the Climate Justice Charter was launched at a mass assembly by ecofeminists. The Charter was the culmination of 6 years of activism sparked during the worst crisis in South Africa, the worst drought the country had ever seen, with campaigning led by the Cooperative and Political Alternative Center and the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. At the heart of the Charter is a bold vision for systemic change, one that includes the rights of nature as the 13th systemic alternative for transformative change. The concept of rights of nature challenges us to think of our relationship with the more than human world, recognizing that nature itself has inherent rights that deserve protection and respect. It is important to note that post-apartheid South Africa continues to face environmental apartheid, with mainly Black communities living in townships that are plagued by toxic waste. These are areas that are mostly situated near industries that produce harmful fumes, and people are exposed to polluted air and are exposed to polluted water. Our approach to rights of nature is therefore based on an understanding for the need for environmental justice for many of these communities who continue to live in these areas, but also the need for earth justice for the more than human world. The Climate Justice Charter movement has held several mass assemblies and actions as part of advocating for and speaking about the rights of nature. In 2021, we can talk about resisting shale as part of defending our ocean commons. We had discussions in 2022 around harmonious coexistence with nature, advancing the rights of nature and human rights in Africa, and protecting endangered ecosystems and wildlife, to Earth Day in 2023, when we officially launched our Rights of Nature campaign, one shaped by community engagements, by feedback from endorsing organizations, and by several members of the Climate Justice Charter movement. On the 29th of August, we officially launched this campaign on the rights of nature. And today's webinar will be exploring the rights of rivers, because rivers carry more than water. They carry memories. They carry connections with the more than human world. And I'm very thankful today. We have two wonderful speakers, Nosintu, Mcimeli. We also have Touriq Jenkins here with us. Touriq is a convener of the Anti-Repression Working Group of the C19 People's Coalition and an accredited monitor of the South African Human Rights Commission. As chair of the Restorative Justice Forum based at the Center for African Studies, University of Cape Town, he convenes the Commission on Sacred Human Remains and Land. He is the High Commissioner of the Khoi Traditional Indigenous Council. You will forgive me for mispronouncing the name. And he is involved in various civic, heritage, and environmental structures, including the Observatory Civic Association, Two Rivers Urban Park Association, and the Civic Action in Public Participation. Touriq, I'm so happy that you are with us here today. Thank you so much for your time. You will have 15 minutes and thereafter followed by Comrade Nosintu Mcimeli, who I will introduce when she's about to speak. And thereafter we'll open it up for discussion. Over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Comrade Charles, for the introduction. And just by way of clarity, I will be speaking on behalf of Save Our Sacred Lands, which I'm the convener of, which is an intersectional campaign that includes basically most of the entities that you have mentioned. So I thought to begin with, just to give a history of the major human rights, indigenous rights, and environmental rights struggle that we, as a conjoined set of communities, have been fighting for basically for the last 80 years. This is the issue of the Amazon development on the confluence of the sacred Black and Leesbeek rivers. I'm going to speak mostly around the history of the Leesbeek River, insofar as it relates to a particular precinct, known today as the broader Two Rivers Urban Park, and a history of liberation and resistance, and how especially the entanglement and colonial encounter that was experienced and is still experienced along the embankments of this river gives us a very important grounding insofar as the trajectory of not just the colonial project, but also the extent to which colonialism, apartheid, spatial planning have had and continue to have major influences on the devastating impact on natural resources and especially our riverine systems. So within the context of the Two Rivers Urban Park, where the confluence area is, we start off with a very important interaction that was between the Portuguese and the Khoi on the 1st of March 1510. Many of you would know that the first battle of liberation and resistance took place in this area around, it's commonly called the Battle of Salt River. And it was here where Francisco de Almeida, who was the viceroy to the Portuguese king and was in charge of the largest and most powerful naval fleet of Portugal at the time, at the apex of its sort of colonial power. De Almeida was responsible for basically the development and augmentation of the colonial fabric in Goa, in South Asia, and he set up sail around the Cape of Good Hope, where he anchored, and what ensued, in short, was a very important battle against the Peninsula Khoi after a raid that had taken place within the Two Rivers Urban Park on a major kraal. And here, de Almeida and his men along the embankments of the river were confronted with a standing Khoi army that had a symbiotic relationship with their cattle, which formed a phalanx and drove de Almeida and his men to the sea. And this then marked the largest defeat at the hands of an indigenous community against the Portuguese. And because of this particular defeat, where de Almeida himself was killed, a dozen of his captains and approximately 87 men, the Portuguese issued an edict not to venture in anchoring around or stopping around the Cape of Good Hope for the next 100 years. Now, along the same territory, in 1657, this is 5 years after Jan van Riebeeck now has decided to settle, a very important series of events take place along the embankments of the Leesbeek River. Firstly, the employees of the Dutch East India Company, which is the largest now company on earth, it has its own standing army, and certainly is expressing colonial intent, decides to gift its employees, the Dutch East India Company employees, land on either side of the Leesbeek River here in Observatory in 1657. This is a very important moment in our history, because this is when Roman Dutch law was deployed through the use of title deeds that were weaponized to legitimize indigenous land theft. And with the imposition of this colonial settler project on these embankments, we also saw the cutting off of the river from indigenous communities in terms of having access to the river. And Jan van Riebeeck did three major things from this particular precinct, which would forever reshape, I think, the future of this country. First, he implemented a militarized barrack on what is today the South African Observatory and parts of what is today the River Club or Riverlands. And secondly, he put up a palisaded fence, an initial iron fence, which is now known as the infamous almond bush fence, which stretches from where this particular development begins by the shunting Praza yards just behind the development all along the Liesbeek River up to where the Liesbeek River starts in Constantia. And that became, the river then had become a frontier zone. And so in 1659, we saw the onset of the first Khoi-Dutch War as a result of the usurpation of land and the cutting off of the river. And thirdly, as I'd mentioned, another important aspect here was that Jan van Riebeeck deployed slaves from the Dutch East India territories, and they came from Java, Goa, East and West Africa, Madagascar. And these slaves tilled the topsoil of what was normally before a pastoral terrain in between summer seasons, shared between various peninsular Khoi groupings, and basically repurposed this land for commercial agricultural reasons. And so we see the expansion of the Freeburger farms, taking place. Once the outbreak of the first Khoi-Dutch War occurs, what follows is basically a series of wars of liberation and resistance that fan out across Southern Africa over another 180-year trajectory. And the impact of this in terms of the Khoi and San exile from the Western Cape and the ongoing attrition and battles, are felt across neighboring countries. So we then determined that this then is an epicenter of liberation and resistance. It holds the etchings of what then would come as the genocide of the Cape San and the forced removal of the Khoi, and over time, how the descendant tributary communities that are derived from this very complex grouping of both the San and Khoi, as well as the so-called slave groupings that came from around the world, now all form part of a very important, tapestry of our South African self. However, under the very cruel term colored, this term basically subsumed a number of these indigenous identities and other identities, and the ostensibly many of the descendant communities of the San and Khoi have been relegated to the shotgun concrete jungles of the Cape Flats that are on the receiving end of this ongoing sort of expression and perpetuation of colonial and apartheid spatial planning. So I think it's really important when we talk about the rivers in this country and we talk about the history of occupation that we have a particular starting point here at the Liesbeek River. It is also at its confluence a very sacred place for a number of reasons. One of which is that today, for example, and yesterday, which is around the equinox, the sun from from this particular meeting point of the two rivers sets on top of Lion's Head. And it is also a place where, for example, the South African Observatory has been established, which has made a number of great Western scientific breakthroughs, like, it was here at this observatory that the world was discovered to be round, and a whole host of other things, the world's first air conditioners to cool down the satellite. But I think one cannot deny the fact that this particular terrain is a very unique and powerful place in terms of the universe, and that pre-existing Western science has always been an indigenous knowledge system that was very close in terms of its symbiotic relationship to the universe, to the cosmos, to the stars, to the river, the land, and sentient animals. It is from this particular epicenter too that we see how the separation of human beings from the river occurs because of how land is being reframed. The land then is measured, it becomes private property, and over time we see how animals are can hunted to extinction. So of the first animals to become extincted would include the quagga, the bluebuck, and the Cape lion, all endemic animals to the region, but also very important in terms of the cultural expression and rituals of the Southern Khoi. And once the dislocation of the river happens with the landscape, so too was their dislocation in terms of one's umbilical connection spiritually with the soil, which is why in the Western Cape and elsewhere in this country, we have this unfortunate phenomena of millions of Africans that are unconvinced that we're African because of an ongoing de-Africanization project that in essence also took place and started with the dislocation of these very symbiotic entities that form the indigenous self, the indigenous body, and how the indigenous body works and understands its relation to the universe, the cosmos, the land, animals, and in particular water. So in this context, we then move to 2015, where the communities here of an inappropriate scale development to the tune of 150,000 square meters of concrete bulk that would be put unlawfully on a floodplain. And as time goes on, we realize that it's actually Amazon would be the anchor tenant for one of the main buildings. And what then pursues over the following years is a fight between a range of environmental organizations, civics, indigenous communities, against key stakeholders such as the City of Cape Town, the Western Cape government, the private developer itself, and Amazon, in order to stop this inappropriate development. Now, what has happened is that after a series of court cases, initially the development was stalled with an interim interdict. That interim interdict was overturned, and now there is another court matter that is on the go in order to bring back the initial interdict. But in the meantime, huge development has taken place of the site. It's a 5.2 billion rand site. There are still massive buildings that are currently being developed. But one of the things that I wanted to mention about is how the Liesbeek River, as it enters into this private property of what is now called the Riverlands, has actually been redefined as a stormwater ditch. And I think this particular point is really relevant to us insofar as how this reframing of the personhood, this reframing of a sentient entity, really does speak to the ongoing kind of colonial expression and project that still kind of is in action, since 1657. One of the key arguments here was that the city and the developer had argued that the Liesbeek River, in fact, is not a river. It's because of the extent to which it's been canonized, redirected, and all those kinds of things. It, in fact, is a stormwater ditch. And so by conveniently reframing it as a stormwater ditch as it enters into the property, basically means that the developer that was intending and has done so, building 150,000 square meters of concrete bulk, needn't have to cater for the existing legal requirements of at least 40 to 50 meters buffer zone between a riverine system and a development, and instead decided, well, to just completely reframe the river. Now, this is a very violent form of erasure. It is an epistemic violent form that really speaks to how the San and Khoi and Black communities, indigenous communities in this country were also reframed. The fact that, one can go to Pretoria, to the museum there, and request a copy of the last permit that was issued for hunters. You could see that, as late as the 1930s, a last permit was issued where on the paper you could see that Bushmen in particular were part of a whole array of animals with a quota in terms of number of animals that one could shoot and kill, so throughout the 1800s, late 1700s, the issuance of these kinds of permits were allowed, and as the San and Khoi communities have also been sort of reframed within the context of flora and fauna, in order to kind of denaturalize a community, so that in this case, colonial powers could also justify colonial conquest by saying that these are heathen, godless entities that do not have a politic, and therefore could justifiably be recipients to a colonial expedition. And we all know things like the papal bulls and the empty land theory, and so on and so forth. So just to conclude, irrespective of whether the Liesbeek River has been decolonized, moved, deconcretized, concretized, and so on, she is a river and remains one, and will continue and does continue moving to the sea. And this particular battle that we fight at the conference area still today really is also around the importance of us not just protecting the river, but also the narrative that comes around the peopling of this place. Being an epicenter of liberation and resistance, we recognize this as a place of ostensibly an original sin, and should be deployed rather for the purposes of healing, for restorative justice, for truth and reconciliation commission for the San and Khoi, but also for all the rivers that have been devastated, for the renosterphote and the landscape in this country that has been smashed, and that we as activists and comrades, spend are committed in terms of preserving in the context of climate change. The irony too is that it is Amazon Web Services that has also made its African headquarters there, an entity which of course is massively criticized for its contribution to climate change, and also in terms of its in the case of automated weaponry systems, how AWS and Google as tech companies are part of the engineering of the genocide that is unfolding in the occupied territories, and how rivers there too are occupied, and that water is not an accessible thing by right to Palestinians, but by the occupying force. And in many ways, we have these kinds of similarities and so on playing out, over here. So to conclude, I think, we cannot remove the legacy of colonialism and apartheid spatial planning insofar as how we look at the reclaiming of our rivers. And importantly, that for every river, there is an indigenous body. There are indigenous communities that people these rivers, and that we cannot look at environmental rights without placing into the center the dignity and the sense of belonging of Black African bodies, and that environmental greenwashing or indigenous washing in terms of destructive forces that will use money to smash terrains, to pollute rivers, is something that we must really fight for strongly, to ensure that the peopling and the dignity and the legacy and the orality of indigenous communities are always placed in the center, because the songs of the river is the poetry that sits in the heart of our Indigenous people and in the heart of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Touriq, for these very, very powerful insights. Thank you so much for taking us through, the history of occupation and the fact that so many people still don't even have access to rivers, as someone was saying in the chat, the history of dispossession, linking rivers to meaning, to epistemicide, the intersection of water, power, and of course, the colonial legacy. In the Climate Justice Charter movement, we talk of a plurivision, which as its starting point is addressing the legacies of the past because those cannot be ignored in the fight for justice, environmental justice, or even earth justice. Thank you so much for those powerful insights. We'll now move to Comrade Nosintu Mcimeli. Comrade Nosintu is the founder of Abanebhongo, People with Disabilities. She's one of the founding members of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and is the coordinator of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign in the Eastern Cape Province. She's leading the development of home gardens in the community of Nqamakwe, developing agroecology as well as agroforestry projects. Comrade Nosintu will be talking about some of their river cleaning initiatives in Nqamakwe, but also how they are reclaiming the river and what the river means to the community as more than just a water source. Comrade Nosintu, over to you. Thank you very much. Comrade Nosintu, can you hear me? Comrade Nosintu, are you there? Comrade Nosintu is just having some issues with the microphone, but she'll sort that out as soon as possible. Let's just give her 1 minute.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, comrade. Yes. Yeah, I am Nosintu Mcimeli, and I am the founder of Abanebhongo Persons with Disabilities here in the rural villages of Eastern Cape. So I will just like be briefly on what Abanebhongo Persons with Disabilities. As everything we do, we involve and include people living with disabilities. We have decided to challenge the issue of water by using our available resources in the villages, that is rivers. And we realize that the rivers are contaminated, and we are cleaning them, and we're starting slowly but surely cleaning those rivers, and we actually finally identified that and realized and identified that there are those indigenous like ponds that are actually like in the rivers. So after the heavy rains, those ponds come out and being visible. So we cleaning them, we dig them, and we try to revive them so that when the rivers goes dry, those indigenous ponds are actually like surviving for the whole community to actually like get clean, healthy, and indigenous water that is non-stop. So what we've done already, it's working because those indigenous ponds like Imitombo, they are not drying out. They are helping now more people. And what we like about them is that they are attached on the river banks. So they are not are being disturbed by the livestock. The livestock just go there by the river and drink the water, not going to those ponds. The pond stays clean. So now what we are planning to actually now we are planning to fence them now. I'm using, yes, what we have, like we collected now the woods from the forest, not actually deforesting, but we're collecting those woods, and we are collecting that old fence that are in the fields, so that we can fence them around and create some gates and nice safe steps for the children also to be able to get to that water. So that is what we are doing at this moment. So those are the things that we are actually doing to fight the lack of water in our villages, using what we have to build what we know for everyone in our communities and in our villages. So yeah, I think that's it from my side.
Thank you so much, Comrade Nosintu. You are doing amazing work in your community. Comrades, now the conversation is open. You can type your comments or questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will allow you to speak. Perhaps to kick things off, my question will go to you, Comrade Touriq. And we know the Western Cape has a lot of private dams. And my question is, how does the weaponization of rivers through damming and diversions dispossess local communities, and what can be done about this?
I think the best example of this was during the water crisis. At the time, I was part of a water warriors entity that was really trying to look into what were the root causes of this particular water crisis, and the fact that at the time, I recall, Mcimeli went to Constantia as his first port of call to open water bottles for Constantia residents as the basically the first step to kind of now alleviate communities that were suffering. One of the things I think that I learned during that particular crisis was how the city had responded to the crisis. The city responded to the crisis not in a humanitarian way, but actually in a securitized way. Its first briefing was with the South African Police Service, and then it was briefing the city central improvement districts, which more or less focus most of their budget on securitization with private security companies. And the reason why I mentioned this was because of how the city's default kind of thinking was towards a state of emergency as we understand it in apartheid, as opposed to contacting communities and getting into an integrated plan of co-design insofar as the crisis was concerned. So when we look at how we have these dams that you're speaking about, but we also have areas that are continually under threat, which are so important environmentally. If we take a look at open green spaces that are continually being identified for inappropriate development for large-scale concrete. If you take a look at a number of other challenges around the city, that have aquifers are beneath their agricultural lands and are continually having to fend off the threat of development. It shows that there has always been a particular priority around the large-scale infrastructural imposition of massive projects that inordinately have environmental adverse consequences. With regards to how we as a city have actually gone into finding innovative ways of dealing with what might be a future crisis has been very strange. You know, there were talks of bringing in um, water generators that would convert seawater into fresh water, and and the like, which haven't really sort of come to fruition. But also in terms of what happens to surface water. Um, all along, I think since the water crisis, there was a trend where JoJo tanks were being deployed. Surface water there was a massive attempt to galvanize communities in terms of how they'll be able to sustain for themselves um, rainwater that could be deployed, in various ways. But that whole initiative seems to have kind of um, tapered off, over the last years. The, the privatization of water bodies and access to those water bodies remains a massive problem. But not just that, in terms of how taps and access to water and the systems of water meters, for example, um, also creates a very oppressive environment for poor working class Black communities to access free running water. And the cutting off of the rivers, the cutting off of these dams, and the fact that uh, these dams are not geared in any way to allow for a a meeting point for communities to engage with the planning, with the maintenance, what happens in these dams, and also the extent to which water distribution and the priorities of water distribution remain so unequal across the city. Whereas it's absolutely no problem to access very clean, fresh, extraordinary mineral, healthy water, in certain areas that are close to the mountain, and also closer to to the sea. Whereas due to apartheid spatial planning, where we have massive high density populations that are sitting away from the CBD areas, um, access to water there as a priority um, has been has really been a massive issue, and the extent to which why these dams and these mass water bodies um, are either cut off, dislocated from the communities, or also situated so far from these communities that they don't even know where they exist. And if you ask any, if you go into many of the um, township areas in our city that are reeling from apartheid spatial planning, and ask them, well, do you know where the main 5 dams are? Have you been there? Have you been able to take your family there and to show that this is part of our ecosystem? It's part of our city. It's part of our landscape. Um, don't be surprised if the answer is a simple no. So I think there is a need for a much more sincere and vigorous integrated system of accessibility, of also knowledge and information, and also rights in terms of what are our ingrained rights as people with regards water, and especially natural riverine systems, natural systems of of lakes, ponds, and even the larger artificially created dams, some of which are sitting on top of Table Mountain. And just to give you, a sense of how inaccessible that can be, the fact that Table Mountain is a World Heritage Site, but if anyone on the call wants to delve a little bit into the actual process of that, you'd find that even in the context of that nomination, the mention of the San and Khoi is is few and far in between, and I think again, while we have these protections on the mountain, those protections are based on a philosophy, and are based on a certain sets of arguments that has dislocated, ignored, and erased conveniently indigenous communities in terms of custodianship, in terms of ritual, and in terms of this very, very important symbiotic relationship that we have as humans, as people, with our natural environment.
Thank you so much for that. Comrades, I want to apologize for Comrade Nosintu. She has dropped off. She's been having network difficulties. Again, if you have a question, you can please post a question in the chat. Alternatively, you can raise your hand and we will enable your microphone. Comrade Touriq, I've been following the case of the Amadiba Crisis Committee and others against Shell. And there's been a constant argument that Advocate Thembeka Ngcukaitobi made in the High Court, in the Supreme Court, and in the Constitutional Court as well, which is that one of the reasons the community is saying no to Shell, it's because in the oceans, Shell would disturb the ancestors. It's an argument he made in the High Court, in the Supreme Court of Appeals, and in the Constitutional Court as well. And I think it's such a profound and decolonial argument that would bring ancestors to the Constitutional Court itself. So linking that to the discussion we've been having on rivers, what has been the cultural and the spiritual significance of rivers to the Khoi and to the San communities?
Well, Advocate Thembeka will be, he's part of our legal team, and rightly so, because I think we're dealing with a particular kind of jurisprudence that has powerfully been able to, catalyze our constitutional, a whole set of constitutional mandates. I think the powerful thing about the Shell case is the extent to which indigenous knowledge systems are, in fact, intangible systems, in terms of some of them, in terms of the argument, which are defended and enshrined within our constitution. And the reason why this is really important is for decades, the environmental argument, as well as the heritage argument, has been within a built-in environment, has been this colonial separation of environment and heritage, as if these are two things that are separated. And I think it's this cauterization in terms of how we view what is an holistic sort of framework, opens up a very powerful decolonial framework of how we accept and allow the articulation of how a community expresses its sense of belonging at a particular space. And in this sense, when the elders said that, all the excessive disturbance that were being caused by the testing in the waters were disturbing the ancestors, was a very powerful narrative which needed to be defended. And so it opens up, I think, arguably for the first time, an extremely important narrative around the dignity and the power of indigenous communities' will to ensure that their cultural practices and connections with the ancestral well-being of this overall African sense of who we are is really, really important. So it just means that we don't look at rivers, we don't look at oceans as commodities, as entities that, here's water, I'm going to use water for X, Y, and Z, but that invested and imbued within these elements are profound and deep histories of meaning, and that we are moving away from the mere impact assessments, moving away from literally impacting assessments as if you would assess a product to a much deeper, complex way of establishing what meaning is held within these natural systems, and the extent to which these meanings speak to the dignity of people and the dignity of a broader African cosmology that is perennially under threat, that is perennially under, in terms of culture, and especially within the San and Khoi community in terms of language, and to the point where, one can present an oral tradition, a spiritual argument, one that is embedded within the history of a particular place, celebrated and communed by people who are connected to that place, to the point where it is able to halt, massive corporations with endless amounts of resources that have obviously become very used to pretty much, entering into bargained kind of relationships with governments and communities in order to have their way. And I think this is a very, very important moment for us in this country, and also in other places like in India, for example, where extraordinary precedent has been made, where skyscrapers have been ordered demolition, simply because the high courts have become completely fed up with billionaire entities entering into communities, building these massive buildings, and completely not taking into consideration issues of meaningful engagement, of consent, and so on, and basically factoring in their violations, unlawfulness, and illegalities. They factor those in the budget of these large scale sort of developments. And so I think the point is that there are things that are just not for sale. You can't factor in a budget when you're talking about the dignity of a people, and a dignity of a communal sense of belonging. And I think it's about really completely rewiring what value is, and that in this particular case, not billions nor trillions were to convince otherwise the elders who felt incredibly pained by the fact that ancestors were being disturbed in the sea because of the kind of activities that Shell was engaging in.
Thank you, Comrade Touriq. Let me bring in Comrade Davin into the conversation. Comrade Davin, please unmute.
Good day, comrades. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. And thank you, Touriq, and also Nosintu. Yeah, my question is, because I was struggling since Saturday with the way that the Khoi and the San legal rights are taken forward. Because there are so many organizations, and all of a sudden you see there's queens from whereabout that say that they need to represent the Khoi and the San in the Western Cape. My family, I come from a Khoisan family, a royal family. But the thing is that if you look at the House of Tradition, who is representing us? Because what we see is a lot of corruption happening, because people will come on board and say, no, we're going to represent you. But at the end of the day, our people never get the help that they need. So when I listen, Touriq, to your discussion about the rivers and the access to the rivers, I remember even the Bergrivier in Paarl, where we as family always go to when it's holidays. We went to December, we went to the river, or we went to the mountain, and we went to Paarl Mountain. That was how we grew up in nature. But now people are still struggling to get access to help, legal representatives that can help them with the struggles and the questions that they ask as the First Nation. The people that sit in the House of Tradition is, I think that is, and I must say it, corruption happen all over. And my concern is, how are we going to fight and help people to get access again to the water resources? Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Toven. Comrade Touriq, you can take that, please.
Thank you, Leader Davin, and through Comrade Charles, the Chair. This is a very important question. In fact, it's an extremely important observation. Without saying too much around the complex formations of the San and Khoi and issues around leadership and legitimacy and the problems around the existing San and Khoi Traditional Leadership Act, which in of itself has a range of problems which I would go so far as to say do not really move towards authentic sovereignty, authentic aspects of self-determination. I would say that I personally am interested in the traditional entities that spend their time and resources in defending heritage and environmental terrain that is under threat. Because as Indigenous communities, we have, as I mentioned before, the symbiotic relationship with the environment. And I feel that there is a practice of authenticity when one is able to dig within our historical lineages, not so far as to claim chieftaincy or things like that, but in order to use the sense of belonging to further protect what is under threat. Because as rivers decline, so too do our sense of who we are decline. And the relationship and the responsibility, I think, is around how we move towards restorative justice, towards issues around land access, towards issues around linguistic and ethnicide, and language loss, and the fact that our communities are also reeling from a Woodwardian syndrome of a particular kind of expression that is very distant from an Indigenous narrative, which basically can weaponize being San and Khoi to argue for xenophobia, for example, to argue for for entering into land and mineral resource contracts and arrangements that have completely devastating consequences to the environment and to communities. And so I think that, yes, this is an issue, but it's an issue that is pervasive across all traditional groups in this country and on this continent, really, where you would have this situation where certain councils and so on will take it upon themselves to enter into very kind of compromising contractual financial agreements where so-called benefit sharing will happen at the expense of IKS extraction and so on. So I completely am totally sympathetic to what you're saying, and I think it's just for important, for us to continue ensuring that in our own way, the expression of the Indigenous self is one that is motivated by healing, motivated through renewal, and also it comes with, I think, a very important level of political consciousness in terms of how it is executed and how it is expressed, so that we don't confuse the narrative of First Nations, for example, with the narrative of white supremacist firstists, or we confuse or weaponize indigeneity as a way of indigenous washing, developments and mining contract arrangements that completely go against a cultural and spiritual understanding of how our ancestors and how we are relating to our environment as well as to each other.
Thank you so much, Comrade Touriq. Comrade Davin's point reminds me of a book by Mahmoud Mamdani on the bifurcated state. Now colonialism also colonized our cultures and how we relate with traditional leadership and the very meaning of traditional leadership itself. We've come to the end of our webinar. Comrade Touriq, I want to thank you so much for your very powerful insights. You've given us a lot to think about for the campaign going forward, but all of us in this room, ideas to take to different movements that we are part of, different constituencies that we are part of. We hope you'll be joining us in one of our upcoming webinars as well. I'd like to thank everyone who took their lunch time to come and join us. And I hope you had a wonderful lunch discussing these ideas with us. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in future discussions. Take care, Comrade Amandla. Thank you.
Mandla.